The winter wind howled through Willow Springs like a wounded beast carrying the bitter scent of coming snow and human desperation. In the cramped barn that served as the town's auction house, Elise Hart stood motionless beside the makeshift podium, watching her life being dismantled piece by precious piece. Her heart hammered against her ribs with each strike of the auctioneer's gavel. The sound echoed off the rough wooden walls like gunshots, each one driving another nail into the coffin of her dreams. That oak bed frame where she and Henry had whispered their hopes for the future, where he had carved their initials on their 3rd anniversary just 8 months ago, was now being sold to strangers who wouldn't even meet her eyes. At 26, Elise possessed the kind of beauty that frontier hardship couldn't quite erase: high cheekbones that spoke of strength, green eyes that had learned to hide pain, and auburn hair that caught lamplight like burnished copper beneath her black widow's bonnet. But it was the set of her shoulders straight as a rifle barrel, despite the weight of grief pressing down on them, that marked her as someone who refused to break, even when everything around her was crumbling. "What am I bid for this fine cast-iron stove?" the auctioneer called out, his voice cracking slightly in the frozen air. "Belonged to the late Henry Hart, Lord rest his soul. Perfect for heating a cabin through the worst winter storms." $8, called Deadshot Murphy from the back of the barn, his scarred face splitting into a grin that revealed teeth stained brown from tobacco and meanness. The man's left leg dragged slightly as he shifted his weight, a souvenir from an old gunfight that had left him with a permanent limp and a disposition sour as week old milk. Beside him stood his constant companion, Greasy Pete Kowalski, whose unwashed bulk strained against a coat that had seen better decades. Pete's small eyes glittered with malicious amusement as he watched Elise's face for any crack in her composure. $10, countered Mrs. Henderson from the mercantile, shooting a sympathetic glance toward Elise. But her voice lacked conviction. Everyone in Willow Springs knew this auction was mere theater, a legal charade designed to give theft the appearance of legitimacy. The bidding continued, but Elise's mind drifted to 6 months ago, when Henry had surprised her with that stove, hauling it back from Tucson in his freight wagon, with a grin as wide as the territorial sky. "Now you can bake those apple pies year-round," he'd said, spinning her around their tiny cabin until she was dizzy with laughter and love. Now Henry was buried on the hill behind their cabin, and she was watching strangers haggle over the stove where she'd cooked their last breakfast together. "Sold to the gentleman in the back for $15. The gavel fell like a judge's sentence, and another piece of her past vanished into Deadshot Murphy's grubby hands. She knew he didn't need a stove. Pike's men were buying everything to send a message that reached deeper than any words could go. "Next item," the auctioneer announced, consulting his ledger with the practiced indifference of a man who had presided over too many such tragedies. "Water rights to Ghost Creek, including the cabin and 40 acres of prime grazing land. Opening bid is $500 to satisfy the outstanding lien." A collective intake of breath swept through the barn. $500 was more money than most folks in Willow Springs saw in 3 years of honest work. The lien itself was a masterpiece of forgery documents claiming Henry owed money to the Territorial Savings Company, a bank that had never existed anywhere except in Roland Pike's imagination. Elise's throat constricted as if a noose were tightening around it. Without those water rights, she was nothing, a 26-year-old widow with no family, no prospects, and nowhere to run in a territory that devoured the weak like winter devoured the unprepared. "The lien is fraudulent." She called out, her voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd like a blade through silk. "My husband never borrowed money from any Territorial Savings Company. No such institution has ever been registered in this county or any other." Sheriff Malcolm Dwyer shifted uncomfortably near the barn door, his star-shaped badge catching the lamplight. A man in his 40s with the soft belly of someone who had grown comfortable with corruption, Dwyer cleared his throat with theatrical authority. "Ma'am, the Territorial Court has ruled on the validity of that debt. This auction is legal and binding." Legal, perhaps. Elise replied, her green eyes flashing with controlled fury that made several men in the crowd step back involuntarily. But hardly just when the same man who benefits from this sale was present at every step of the process that created it. She didn't need to name Roland Pike. Every soul in that barn knew who owned Sheriff Dwyer's loyalty, just as they knew who would emerge as the winning bidder when this charade reached its inevitable conclusion. Pike controlled 15,000 acres of the finest grazing land in the territory. But Ghost Creek was the golden key that would unlock the entire valley. Without water, his empire would crumble like sun-baked adobe in the desert heat. $500, came a gravelly voice from near the barn's entrance. Pike himself stepped forward, a man of 52, who carried himself with the weathered confidence of someone who had carved his fortune from hostile territory through a deadly combination of shrewd dealing and strategic violence. His silver hair was immaculately groomed despite the frontier setting, and his black coat was expensive enough to feed a family for half a year. Gold teeth gleamed when he smiled, which he did now as his pale blue eyes fixed on Elise, with the cold intensity of a snake studying a mouse. "Any other bidders?" the auctioneer asked, though his tone suggested he considered the question a mere formality required by territorial law. Silence stretched through the barn like a taut bowstring. Elise felt the weight of every gaze, some sympathetic, others carefully neutral, all of them helpless. These were good people mostly, but they had families to protect and livelihoods that depended on Pike's continued goodwill. She couldn't blame them for their silence, even as it sealed her fate like wax on a death warrant. "Going once. Hold your horses there, friend." Dead shot. Murphy stepped forward, his spurs jingling against the packed dirt floor, like tiny bells announcing the arrival of something sinister. "Before we finish up this fine piece of business, I got me a proposition for the widow lady." Ice water flooded Elise's veins. In her experience, nothing good had ever followed such words from Pike's hired guns. Deadshot's grin widened, revealing those tobacco-stained teeth in all their rotted glory. "See, there's been considerable talk around town about Mrs. Hart here. Speculation, you might say, about whether she's truly the grieving widow she claims to be, or if maybe she's been entertaining gentlemen callers in that lonely little cabin of hers." "How dare you?" Elise breathed, but Deadshot held up a grimy hand. Now, ma'am. I ain't making accusations, just repeating what decent folks are wondering about. See, in a proper Christian community like ours, a widow's got to be above reproach. Pure as mountain snow, you understand. Any hint of impropriety, well. He shrugged with elaborate casualness. Might make God-fearing citizens question whether such a woman deserves to keep property that could go to more deserving hands. The trap was elegant in its cruelty. In 1879, a woman's reputation was more fragile than spun glass and twice as precious as gold. A widow could inherit property under territorial law, but only as long as the community accepted her moral standing. Rumors of improper conduct could destroy her legal claims faster than any forged document, and everyone present understood this fundamental truth of frontier justice. So here's what I'm proposing. Deadshot continued, his voice carrying easily through the hushed barn. Any man brave enough to spend the night in that cabin with our dear widow can win himself $50 of Pike's own money. Course, if someone takes up such an offer, well, that might settle all questions about Mrs. Hart's character once and for all. Greasy Pete chuckled, a sound like gravel grinding in a mill. $50 is mighty generous, Deadshot. Though I reckon most men would want to inspect the merchandise before making such an investment. The insult struck Elise like a physical blow, but she forced herself to remain standing. She would not give these animals the satisfaction of seeing her break, not here in front of the entire town. Around the barn, she could see the calculation beginning in people's eyes. $50 would buy seed for spring planting medicine for a sick child's supplies to last until the next harvest. In a community where cash money was scarcer than honest politicians, it represented a fortune that could change a family's entire future. No takers? Deadshot asked, scanning the crowd with mock disappointment. Come now, gentlemen. Surely the widow's not that fearsome a prospect. The silence stretched on, broken only by the wind, howling through the gaps in the barn walls and the occasional nervous cough from the assembled crowd. Elise felt her last hope dying like an ember in winter wind. Then from the shadows near the barn's rear corner, where the lamplight barely reached, came a voice as steady as bedrock. I'll take your bet. Every head turned toward the speaker. A figure stepped forward from the darkness, and Elise felt her breath catch in her throat like a fishhook finding flesh. The man was Apache. That much was immediately clear from his angular features and the fluid way he moved, like water flowing over stone. He stood perhaps 6 feet tall, with shoulders broadened by years of frontier hardship, wearing buckskin pants and a wool shirt that marked him as one of the Apache scouts who worked with the territorial army. His black hair fell to his collar beneath a weather-beaten hat that had seen better seasons, and his dark eyes held an intelligence that seemed to catalog everything while judging nothing. But it was the weapons he carried that marked him as truly dangerous. A Colt revolver rode his right hip with the easy familiarity of long partnership, while a Spencer carbine was slung across his back, a 7-shot repeater capable of rapid fire in skilled hands. This was not a man who made decisions lightly or without considering all possible consequences. Well, I'll be hornswoggled. Deadshot muttered, his confidence wavering like a candle in wind. An Indian wants to play our little game. Sheriff Dwyer's hand drifted toward his own weapon, his face flushing with the indignation of a man whose authority had been quietly challenged. Now, hold on just 1 minute. This is a civilized community. We don't need... The bet was open to any man. The Apache interrupted, his English accented but perfectly clear. Or do your words carry no more weight than smoke on the wind, Sheriff? Dwyer's face turned the color of a ripe tomato, but before he could sputter a response, Pike himself spoke from his position near the auction block. Let him try. Pike said, genuine amusement dancing in his pale eyes like winter lightning. Though I suspect our Apache friend might find the accommodations somewhat less comfortable than he anticipates. The stranger turned his attention to Elise for the first time, and she saw something unexpected in those midnight dark eyes, not lust or greed, but the kind of professional assessment a scout might give to dangerous terrain before deciding on the safest path through it. Mrs. Hart, he said with a slight nod that somehow managed to convey both respect and determination. I am Atsadi, which means blacksmith in my language, though I have not worked iron in many seasons. I propose to sleep by your door, with my rifle ensuring that your safety and reputation remain intact through the night. You may keep your own weapon and use it if you feel threatened in any way. When morning comes, these men will pay the $50 they have promised, and no one will question your character again. The barn fell so silent that Elise could hear her own heartbeat drumming in her ears. She studied the Apache's face with the intensity of someone whose life might depend on reading another person's true intentions. She found no deception there, only a steady resolve that reminded her powerfully of Henry in his better moments, that same quiet strength that didn't need to make noise to prove itself. And what do you want in return for this service? She asked, because frontier life had taught her that no man offered help without expecting payment of some kind. Atsadi's smile was thin as a knife blade, but somehow reassuring. Justice, Mrs. Hart. And perhaps the truth about what really happened to your husband. The words hit Elise like lightning striking a tall pine. Henry's death had been ruled justified homicide, a dispute over grazing rights that had turned deadly when he allegedly drew his weapon first. But Henry's Colt had been found still in its holster when they brought his body home, and the supposed witnesses to the fight had all been Pike's men. You know something, she whispered, hardly daring to hope. Atsadi's eyes flicked toward Pike, then back to her face. I know that sometimes the truth is buried deeper than graves, Mrs. Hart. And I know that some debts can only be paid in kind. Deadshot shifted uncomfortably, his scarred hand moving closer to his gun. This is getting mighty philosophical for a simple wager. You in or out, Indian? I am in, Atsadi said simply. But let us be absolutely clear about the terms. I will sleep by Mrs. Hart's door. She will retain possession of her weapon, and anyone who approaches the cabin uninvited during the night will be considered a hostile threat and dealt with accordingly. Mighty protective for a complete stranger. Greasy Pete observed his pig-like eyes narrowing with suspicion. Atsadi's smile never wavered. I have found that protecting innocent people is often the most effective way to draw out those who are not. The implications of his words settled over the barn like smoke from a grass fire. Pike's men exchanged glances, and Elise saw something that might have been worry flicker across Deadshot's scarred features. Done and agreed, Pike said before his men could raise any objections. $50 to our Apache friend if he lasts the night in the lady's company. But if anything, unfortunate, should happen to disturb the peace of our community, well, that would be an entirely different matter altogether. The threat was clear enough to cut glass. Pike was gambling that his men could either frighten Atsadi away or manufacture some excuse to have him arrested or killed before dawn. Either outcome would serve his purposes perfectly, and the Apache would be gone, and Elise's reputation would be destroyed by association with violence and scandal. Atsadi nodded, as if Pike had simply offered directions to the nearest water source. Mrs. Hart, shall we gather your remaining belongings and retire to your cabin? Elise realized that every eye in the barn was fixed on her, waiting for her decision, like vultures waiting for something to die. Accept the Apache's offer, and she might salvage both her property and her reputation from the wreckage Pike had made of her life. Refuse, and she would be homeless by morning, with nothing but the clothes on her back and whatever coins she could scrape together. But there was something else driving her decision, something that went beyond mere survival. In Atsadi's eyes, she had glimpsed a recognition that matched her own, and the look of someone who had been wronged and was seeking to set the balance right. Whatever his true motives might be, they seemed to align with her desperate need for justice in a world that had shown her precious little of it. Yes, she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Let us go home. The wind had picked up considerably by the time Elise and Atsadi reached her cabin, driving needles of sleet against the windows with the persistence of an enemy that never tired. Ghost Creek ran high and fast from the recent mountain snows, its voice a constant murmur in the darkness beyond the cabin walls. A sound that had once been comforting, but now seemed to whisper warnings of danger approaching through the winter night. Elise struck a match and lit the oil lamp on her kitchen table, casting flickering shadows that danced across the rough-hewn logs Henry had shaped with his own hands during their first hopeful summer together. The cabin was small, but solidly built, with a stone fireplace that dominated one wall and a narrow loft above where she stored her winter supplies. It had been their sanctuary, once a place where they could plan for the future without fear of eavesdroppers or enemies. Now it felt like a fortress under siege, surrounded by hostile forces that wanted nothing more than to see her destroyed. You may build up the fire if you wish, she said, busying herself with lighting additional lamps around the single room. There is coffee if you want some, though I should warn you that supplies have been limited of late. Atsadi nodded and moved to the fireplace with that same economy of motion she was beginning to associate with him. Everything he did seemed deliberate and purposeful, as if he were constantly conserving energy for some greater effort yet to come. He fed kindling to the dying embers with the patience of someone who understood that rushing such things often led to failure. You are not what I expected when I heard an Apache had taken Pike's bet, Elise admitted as she filled the coffee pot from her water bucket. And what did you expect? Atsadi asked, without looking up from his work with the fire. Elise paused, considering her words carefully. Someone looking to take advantage of a desperate situation. A drifter seeking easy money, or perhaps... She trailed off, unsure how to voice her deeper fears without giving offense. Or someone who would force himself on a woman alone and defenseless. Atsadi's tone was matter-of-fact rather than offended. There are such men in this world, both white and Apache. I am not one of them. The fire caught properly, sending warm light dancing across the cabin's interior and chasing away some of the shadows that seemed to lurk in every corner. Atsadi arranged his bedroll near the door, with military precision positioning his Spencer carbine within easy reach. The rifle, Elise noticed, was meticulously maintained and showed signs of frequent use, the weapon of someone who expected to need it and knew exactly how to use it when the time came. You said you might know something about Henry's death, she said, settling into her chair beside the table with her shotgun laid across her lap. The weapon felt reassuringly heavy in her hands, though she prayed she wouldn't need to use it before the night was over. Atsadi was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames, as if they might reveal secrets hidden from ordinary sight. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old anger, carefully controlled but never forgotten. 3 weeks ago, raiders struck an Apache camp at Owl Canyon about 40 miles northeast of here. They came at dawn when most of the warriors were away on a hunting expedition. 23 people died that morning, women, children, and elders, mostly people who had never raised a weapon against anyone. The newspapers blamed it on tribal warfare, said it was Navajo raiders seeking horses and winter supplies. Something cold and terrible began to form in the pit of Elise's stomach. But it wasn't Navajo raiders. No, it was not. Atsadi reached into his jacket and withdrew a piece of twisted metal, a horseshoe that had been bent and scarred by hard use. I found this at the camp, driven deep into the earth by a horse moving at full gallop. Do you see the marking hammered into the heel? Elise leaned forward to examine the shoe more closely. Even in the flickering lamplight, she could make out a distinctive brand burned into the iron, the letter P, enclosed in a circle. Pike's mark, she whispered. Yes. Pike's mark made by his blacksmith and worn by one of his horses. I have been tracking the animal that wore this shoe for 3 weeks, following a trail that led me directly to Willow Springs. The implications struck Elise like an avalanche of understanding. You're saying Pike's men attacked that Apache camp. I am saying that white men wearing war paint and riding shod horses attacked that camp. Atsadi corrected carefully. Apache warriors do not shoe their horses for raids. The noise gives away their position and makes stealth impossible. These men wanted to be heard coming. They wanted witnesses who would survive to spread the story of an Indian attack. But why? Elise asked, though she was beginning to suspect the answer. Fear brings soldiers, Mrs. Hart. And soldiers require supplies, beef, cattle, grain, horses, ammunition. Pike has contracts to provide those supplies to the military posts throughout the territory. But only if there is sufficient Apache unrest to justify maintaining a large military presence in the region. Ainar. The logic was brutal in its simplicity and breathtaking in its callousness. Pike had manufactured the very conflicts he profited from, murdering innocent people and blaming their deaths on tribal warfare to ensure a steady stream of government money flowed into his coffers. But why are you here? Elise pressed. Why take that bed in the barn tonight? Atsadi's dark eyes met hers across the flickering lamplight, and she saw something in them that made her pulse quicken. Not desire, but a shared recognition of purpose that went deeper than personal attraction. Because 4 days ago, while following that trail, I discovered something else. Hidden in a grove of cottonwoods about 5 miles from here, I found the remains of a telegraph message that had been torn up and scattered. I was able to piece together enough of it to read Pike's offer to sell water rights to Ghost Creek to a cattle buyer in Santa Fe. The message was dated 2 days before your husband died. The coffee turned to bitter ashes in Elise's mouth. Henry had been murdered for water killed in cold blood so that Pike could manufacture a fraudulent lien and steal their land through an elaborate charade of legal proceedings. I cannot prove it yet. Atsadi continued. But I believe your husband discovered Pike's connection to the Owl Canyon massacre. Perhaps he saw something during his freight runs or heard something that made Pike consider him a dangerous threat to the entire operation. Henry was hauling supplies to Fort Apache and Fort Thomas regularly. Elise said slowly, pieces of a terrible puzzle beginning to fall into place. He would have heard military gossip about Apache raids, troop movements, requests for additional supplies. And if he began asking the right questions or talking to the wrong people about inconsistencies in the official reports, Pike would have had no choice but to silence him permanently. A sound from outside the cabin made them both freeze, the soft creak of leather saddles and the barely audible snort of horses trying to clear their nostrils in the cold air. Someone was approaching through the darkness, and they were making an effort to move quietly. Atsadi held up one finger for silence, then moved to the window with that same fluid grace that made no sound on the plank floor. He peered carefully through a gap in the crude shutters, his body tense as a coiled spring. How many? Elise whispered, her hand instinctively tightening on the shotgun. 3 horses that I can see. 2 men on foot approaching from the creek side where the brush would give them cover. Through the wind and the sound of rushing water, Elise could now hear voices low and urgent, trying to coordinate their movements without alerting their intended victims. Atsadi eased his Spencer from its position by the door, checking the action with the practiced efficiency of someone whose life had often depended on such preparations. They will attempt to force their way inside, hoping to catch us in what they will later claim was a compromising position. When that fails, they will say we were already engaged in improper conduct when they arrived to investigate reports of disturbance. What can we do? We make it abundantly clear that their presence here is neither expected nor welcome. The voices were growing closer now, and Elise could begin to make out Deadshot Murphy's distinctive rasp. Just get close enough to peek through the window, see what they're up to in there. Atsadi moved to the door and called out in a voice that carried clearly through the storm. The lady and I can hear you out there clear as church bells. I suggest you return to town before someone gets hurt. The voices stopped abruptly, followed by the sound of rapidly whispered conversation, punctuated by what sounded like heated disagreement. We're just checking to make sure everything's proper out here. Deadshot finally called back. Heard some commotion, wanted to make sure the widow was safe and sound. She is perfectly safe. Atsadi replied with deadly calm, and will remain so as long as uninvited guests stay outside where they belong. Now see here, Indian. We got a right to investigate reports of suspicious activity, and we aim to do our duty as citizens of this community. The Spencer's report was like thunder in the confined space of the cabin, the sound so loud that Elise's ears rang, and spots danced before her eyes. Atsadi had fired through the door, the heavy .56 caliber bullets splintering wood and whining off into the darkness beyond. The message was unmistakable and required no translation. On the next shot will not be fired as a warning. Atsadi called out, working the Spencer's lever action to chamber another round with a metallic snap that carried clearly in the cold air. The scrambling sounds of men diving for cover and cursing their luck answered him immediately. Within moments, Elise heard horses being mounted in considerable haste and ridden hard away from the cabin, their hoofbeats fading rapidly into the wind and darkness. Will they come back tonight? She asked when the sound had completely disappeared. Unlikely. They have accomplished what they came for, establishing that there was indeed a disturbance at your cabin, that shots were fired, and that there is evidence of conflict between you and concerned citizens. Tomorrow they will claim they were investigating reports of suspicious activity and were fired upon without provocation by hostile parties. Elise felt her remaining hopes crumble like old adobe bricks in a flash flood. Then we have gained nothing. They will still destroy my reputation and take my land. On the contrary, Atsadi said, examining the bullet hole in the door with professional interest. They have provided us with clear evidence of their own criminal intent. Men genuinely concerned with a widow's welfare do not approach her cabin in the dead of night armed and attempting concealment. Their behavior suggests intent to commit a crime, not prevent one. He was absolutely right, Elise realized. Pike's men had been so eager to manufacture evidence against her that they had overlooked the implications of their own actions. There is something else you should know. Atsadi continued, settling back into position by the door. When I followed that trail from Owl Canyon to this area, I discovered where the raiders had camped the night before the attack. They carved their initials into the bark of a lightning-struck pine, along with a crude map showing the layout of the Apache camp they planned to destroy. One of those sets of initials was DSM, Deadshot Murphy. The implications were staggering. Not only could they potentially connect Pike to the Owl Canyon massacre through physical evidence, but they could directly implicate his most trusted lieutenant in the actual murders. "Why are you really helping me?" Elise asked quietly. "Your people and mine have not always been friendly toward each other." Atsadi was silent for a moment, feeding fresh wood to the fire and watching the flames dance higher. "My grandfather once told me that justice is like water flowing downhill. It will find its own level if you do not try to dam it up with lies and fear. Your husband was murdered for the same reason my people were murdered at Owl Canyon, because one man's greed and hatred mattered more to him than the lives of innocent people. And you believe we can find justice working together? I believe we can find the truth," Atsadi replied with quiet conviction. "And in my experience, truth has a way of creating its own justice, if you are brave enough to speak it aloud, regardless of the consequences." Outside their small circle of warmth and light, the storm continued its assault on the cabin, but inside warmed by the fire, and by the growing certainty that she was no longer facing her enemies alone. Elise felt something she had not experienced since the terrible morning when they brought Henry's body home hope. The coffee was strong and bitter, but it drove away the last traces of cold from her bones and helped steady her nerves for whatever trials the coming day might bring. Tomorrow would undoubtedly bring new challenges, fresh attempts by Pike and his men to destroy everything she had left in the world. But tonight, for the first time in months, she was not alone in her struggle. And somehow that felt like enough to sustain her through whatever darkness lay ahead. Dawn came gray and reluctant, filtered through heavy clouds that promised more snow before the day was through. Elise woke in her chair to find Atsadi already up and moving, studying the tracks left by their midnight visitors in the muddy ground beside the cabin, with the focused intensity of someone reading an important message written in an unfamiliar language. They came from the direction of Pike's ranch, just as we expected. He reported when she joined him, outside, her breath forming small clouds in the bitter morning air. 3 horses moving in single file to minimize their trail. But see this mark here. He pointed to a distinctive impression in the soft earth. This horse favors its left front hoof, and there is a chip in the shoe that creates a unique pattern. Elise knelt beside him, studying the print. To her untrained eye, it looked much like any other horseshoe mark, but she could see that Atsadi was reading the signs as clearly as if they were words printed in a newspaper. You can track them back to their source if necessary, without difficulty. But first, we must prepare ourselves for what comes next. Pike's men will return probably with Sheriff Dwyer and official complaints about our conduct. We need allies who cannot be bought or intimidated, and we need evidence that cannot be disputed in any court of law. They spent the morning making preparations for what both understood would be an escalating conflict. Atsadi showed Elise how to create defensive firing positions, using the cabin's thick log walls for protection, while she shared her knowledge of the local terrain and the locations of neighbors who might prove sympathetic to their cause, despite the obvious risks involved. Dr. Edwin Harper might be willing to help us, she suggested as they worked. He's the one who examined Henry's body after the fight. And he told me privately that the wounds didn't match the story Pike's men told about a fair confrontation between equals. That could be valuable testimony. What about others in the community? Hannah Wells, the school teacher, has been quietly collecting evidence of irregularities in Pike's land dealings for months. Her own family lost their homestead to similar tactics last year, so she has personal reasons for wanting to see justice done. Atsadi nodded approvingly. We will need witnesses who cannot be dismissed as having ulterior motives. Anyone else? Elise's expression grew troubled. Walter Briggs has been complaining loudly that Pike's fences have illegally blocked his cattle's access to the creek. His animals are dying of thirst because of it, but he's also terrified of Pike's retaliation if he speaks out too forcefully. Fear can be a powerful motivator in both directions, Atsadi observed. A man watching his livelihood die might eventually become desperate enough to take risks he would normally avoid. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, far too many horses moving with the measured cadence of men on official business rather than the casual pace of ordinary travelers. 8 riders. Atsadi reported after a quick glance through the cabin window. Sheriff Dwyer in the lead, wearing his badge prominently and trying to look as official as possible. Deadshot Murphy and Greasy Pete are with him along with 5 others I don't recognize. A posse. Elise said, her mouth going dry. They're planning to arrest us. They're planning to try. Sheriff Dwyer reined in his horse exactly 30 yards from the cabin, close enough to be heard clearly, but far enough away to avoid immediate danger from defensive gunfire. He had made an obvious effort with his appearance this morning, wearing his best coat and sporting a fresh shave that made his soft features look almost respectable. Mrs. Hart. He called out in his most official voice. I need to speak with you about the disturbance that occurred here last night. We've received reports of gunfire and threats made against upstanding citizens of this community. Elise stepped onto the cabin's small porch, her shotgun held casually, but visibly at her side. There was no disturbance, Sheriff. Only uninvited visitors who departed when politely asked to do so. According to sworn statements from 3 reliable witnesses, shots were fired at men who were merely attempting to check on your welfare out of Christian concern. That constitutes assault with a deadly weapon, which is a serious crime under territorial law. According to my own direct observation. Elise replied, her voice carrying clearly in the cold morning air. Armed men approached my cabin under cover of darkness without identifying themselves or stating their legitimate business. I would characterize that as criminal trespass at the very least, with strong suggestions of attempted breaking and entering. Dwyer's face flushed red with indignation. Mrs. Hart, I have formal complaints signed by 3 upstanding members of this community accusing you and your companion of immoral conduct and making violent threats against law-abiding citizens. I am here in my official capacity to place you both under arrest pending a proper hearing before Judge Morrison. On what specific grounds? Atsadi had stepped into view, now his Spencer rifle held ready, but not directly threatening. What laws do you claim have been violated? Vagrancy for starters, since you have no legal right to be on this property. Disturbing the peace through the discharge of firearms within town limits. Assault with intent to cause bodily harm. Dwyer was clearly improvising now, throwing out charges in the hope that something would stick long enough to get them into custody. And there is also the matter of formal complaints regarding Mrs. Hart's moral character and fitness to hold property. Complaints filed by whom exactly? Elise demanded. That will be determined at the proper time by the proper authorities. But given the serious nature of the allegations involved, I am required by law to take you both into custody immediately. Judge Morrison Elise knew with sinking certainty was every bit as much Pike's creature as Dwyer himself. A hearing before him would be nothing more than a legal formality, preceding a predetermined verdict of guilty on all counts. "I don't believe we will be accompanying you today, Sheriff," Atsadi said with deadly calm. Dwyer's hand moved toward the grip of his holstered weapon. "That choice is not yours to make, Indian. You are both under arrest, and you will come along peaceably or face the full consequences of resisting lawful authority." The 8 men began to spread out in a rough semicircle, their hands hovering near their weapons with the practiced casualness of men who had performed this particular dance many times before. The moment when words would inevitably give way to violence was approaching fast, and everyone present could feel it building like electricity in the air before a thunderstorm. Sheriff Elise called out, playing for time and hoping to plant seeds of doubt among his followers. "Before you do something that cannot be undone, you might want to consider the evidence we have gathered regarding the true circumstances surrounding my husband's death." "I don't know what you're talking about, and I don't want to hear any more of your wild theories. I'm talking about murder disguised as justified homicide. I'm talking about forged liens and falsified legal documents. I'm talking about the massacre at Owl Canyon and who really ordered that attack on innocent families." For just a moment, Dwyer's confident facade cracked like thin ice over deep water, revealing something that looked distinctly like fear underneath. His reaction told Elise everything she needed to know about his level of involvement in Pike's various criminal enterprises. "You're talking about fantasies and desperate lies," Dwyer said, but his voice had lost much of its earlier conviction. "Nothing that would hold up in any legitimate court of law." "Perhaps not," Elise agreed. "But I suspect the territorial authorities might be very interested in evidence that directly links civilian contractors to unprovoked attacks on Apache reservations. Especially physical evidence that includes horseshoes bearing distinctive ranch brands and spent cartridge casings from expensive military rifles." Atsadi was watching the sheriff's men, carefully noting how several of them shifted uncomfortably and exchanged uncertain glances at Elise's words. Information could be a weapon every bit as powerful as bullets if used correctly, and they were wielding it now to create doubt and division among their enemies. "Enough of this nonsense." Deadshot Murphy called out from his position on Dwyer's left flank, his scarred face twisted with impatience and growing anger. "We came here to arrest dangerous criminals, not to listen to Indian lies and a desperate widow's fairy tales." He spurred his horse forward, aggressively drawing his gun as he rode toward the cabin. It was the spark that ignited the confrontation everyone had been expecting and dreading. Atsadi's Spencer spoke first, the heavy bullet taking Deadshot's horse squarely in the chest and sending both animal and rider tumbling to the muddy ground in a tangle of thrashing limbs. Elise's shotgun roared a heartbeat later, the buckshot whistling over the heads of the scattered posse and causing several horses to rear and bolt with their riders hanging on desperately. "Think the back way," Atsadi shouted, grabbing Elise's arm and pulling her toward the rear of the cabin as return fire began splintering wood and shattering windows around them. They ran hard for the creek, using the solid log walls as cover for the first 50 yards before plunging into the thick brush that grew along the water's edge. Behind them, they could hear Dwyer shouting contradictory orders while his men tried to control their panicked horses and organize some kind of effective pursuit. The old mine shaft. Elise panted as they crashed through a nearly impenetrable thicket of scrub oak and wild berry bushes. Half a mile upstream, accessible through Devil's Canyon. We can reach it without being seen if we follow the creek bed. They ran along the rushing water, using its sound to mask their passage, while staying as low as possible to avoid being silhouetted against the gray morning sky. Twice they heard riders passing nearby, but the combination of thick vegetation and broken terrain worked strongly in their favor. The mine shaft was a relic of the brief silver boom that had brought temporary prosperity to the region before the ore played out and the prospectors moved on to richer ground elsewhere. Now it served mainly as shelter for the occasional traveler and storage space for supplies too bulky or dangerous to keep in town. "We cannot remain here for very long," Atsadi said as they caught their breath in the mine's entrance, the darkness cool and welcoming after their desperate flight. They will organize a systematic search eventually, and this is one of the more obvious places to look for fugitives. But it gives us time to plan our next moves. Elise replied, checking the loads in her shotgun with hands that were steadier than she had any right to expect under the circumstances. And Dwyer's reaction to our accusations proved that we struck very close to home indeed. He knows far more about Pike's criminal activities than he wants to admit publicly. Knowledge without concrete proof remains nothing more than educated suspicion. We need evidence that will convince an honest judge, preferably one who is not already in Pike's pocket. The Circuit Judge Harrison is due to arrive in Willow Springs next month for the regular territorial court session. He has a solid reputation for honesty and fairness, even when it conflicts with local political pressures. A month is a very long time to stay alive when half the county wants you dead or disappeared, Atsadi observed grimly. Elise finished checking her weapon and looked directly into his dark eyes. Then we had better make certain we find that proof quickly, hadn't we? The abandoned mine provided only temporary sanctuary, but it gave them precious time to think and plan without the immediate pressure of pursuit. By afternoon, Atsadi knew search parties would be combing every canyon and draw within 10 miles, and their supplies were limited to what they had managed to grab during their hasty evacuation of the cabin. There is a place we might go, Elise said as they shared water and jerky from Atsadi's pack. Hannah Wells has a small room behind the schoolhouse where she keeps her records and research materials. If Pike's men are concentrating their search on the wilderness areas, they might not think to look for us right in the heart of town. And you are confident that Miss Wells can be trusted completely. She has been gathering evidence of Pike's illegal land acquisitions for months, ever since her own family was driven off their homestead by tactics very similar to what he tried with me. She has every reason to want to see him brought to justice. They waited until full darkness had settled over the valley before making their move using a convenient thunderstorm and the cover it provided to mask their approach to Willow Springs. The town looked entirely different when viewed through the eyes of hunted fugitives. Every shadow could conceal an enemy. Every lighted window might reveal their presence to hostile observers. The schoolhouse sat at the very edge of town, a simple frame building with modest living quarters attached where Hannah Wells made her solitary home. Smoke rose from the chimney, and lamplight glowed warmly behind curtained windows, suggesting that the young teacher was at home, and more importantly, alone. Atsadi circled the building carefully on foot, checking for signs of watchers or hastily prepared traps before giving the prearranged signal that indicated it was safe to approach. Elise made her way to the back door and knocked softly, using a specific pattern that she and Hannah had developed for private communications during their previous clandestine meetings. The door opened almost immediately to reveal a young woman of 25, with intelligent brown eyes and prematurely gray-streaked hair that spoke of too much worry and responsibility for someone her age. Hannah Wells possessed the calloused hands of someone who had grown up working hard for everything she possessed, and the steady, unflinching gaze of someone who had learned through bitter experience not to trust easily or completely. "Elise, thank the Lord you're safe," Hannah said urgently, quickly ushering them inside and securing the door behind them. The whole town has been buzzing like a disturbed beehive with talk about gun battles and Apache raids. Sheriff Dwyer is telling everyone who will listen that you've been kidnapped by hostile Indians and carried off to some unknown fate. The only hostile Indians in this entire territory are the ones Pike's men masquerade as when they want to massacre innocent families, Elise replied with bitter accuracy. Hannah's eyes widened as she took in Atsadi's presence and began to grasp the full implications of what Elise was telling her. You actually have proof that Pike was involved in the Owl Canyon killings. Some proof, but we desperately need more if we hope to convince the territorial authorities to take action against him before he can complete whatever larger plan he's working toward. They spent the next hour carefully sharing information and developing strategy. Hannah produced several thick folders filled with meticulously organized documents, land deeds with suspiciously altered dates, witness statements that had been systematically ignored by local law enforcement, financial records showing highly unusual payments to various county officials, whose modest salaries should never have allowed them to afford such luxury items as new horses and expensive clothing. The pattern becomes unmistakable once you understand what to look for. Hannah explained, spreading papers across her kitchen table in careful arrangements. Pike identifies properties he wants to acquire, then systematically manufactures legal claims against them. Sometimes the method involves forged debt documents, sometimes disputed boundary surveys, sometimes claims of abandonment or failure to pay territorial taxes. Atsadi studied the documents with growing comprehension and mounting anger. How many families have lost their land through these methods? At least 17 that I can document over the past 2 years alone. Most of them chose to leave the area rather than fight a battle they couldn't possibly win, but a few of the more stubborn ones. Hannah's voice trailed off meaningfully. Ended up like Henry. Elise finished the thought with grim certainty. 3 highly suspicious deaths, all involving men who were either actively investigating Pike's business practices or flatly refusing to sell their property voluntarily. The territorial authorities ruled each one either an accident or a justified killing in self-defense. But the circumstances were always questionable when examined closely. A soft sound from outside made all 3 of them freeze instantly. Footsteps on the front porch, followed by a gentle but insistent knocking at the door. Hannah motioned urgently for Elise and Atsadi to move into the storage room while she answered the unexpected summons. "Dr. Harper," they heard her say with obvious relief. "What brings you out on such a dreadful night?" "I heard disturbing reports about the trouble at Elise's cabin earlier today," came the reply in the cultured tones of an educated man fighting to maintain his composure. "Is she truly safe?" "There are rumors spreading through town that she has been captured or killed by hostile Apache raiders." "Please come inside, Doctor. I think you should hear the real truth directly from her own lips." Dr. Edwin Harper was a distinguished man in his 50s who had brought Eastern medical training and humanitarian ideals to the frontier, motivated more by a sense of moral duty than by any desire for personal wealth or advancement. His practice served anyone who required healing regardless of their ability to pay his fees, which had earned him widespread respect throughout the community and made him dangerous enemies among those who preferred profit margins to principles. "Mrs. Hart," he said with unmistakable relief when she emerged from her hiding place. "When I heard about the shooting and the pursuit, I genuinely feared the worst possible outcome. The shooting was entirely in self-defense, Doctor. Pike's men attempted to force their way into my home under completely false pretenses, and we responded accordingly." Dr. Harper nodded grimly. "I suspected as much from the beginning. Sheriff Dwyer's official version of events was suspiciously vague about what his men were actually doing at your cabin in the first place, and why they felt it necessary to approach under cover of darkness." He turned to study Atsadi with professional interest and obvious curiosity. "And you would be the Apache scout who has caused such an extraordinary stir throughout the entire community." "I am Atsadi and Mrs. Hart, and I appear to share some very dangerous enemies in common." "Indeed you do. Hannah, perhaps you should show them what I discovered during my examination of Henry Hart's body." Dr. Harper's expression grew deeply troubled as he produced a carefully folded paper from his coat pocket, a detailed medical diagram drawn in precise scientific handwriting. "2 bullet wounds," he explained, pointing to specific locations on his anatomical sketch. "The first struck Henry in the back, angled sharply upward as if the shooter had been positioned below and behind the victim when he fired. The second wound was inflicted in the side of the head at extremely close range, almost certainly while Henry was already down and helpless. Neither wound is remotely consistent with the official story of a fair fight between 2 men facing each other as equals." Cold-blooded murder, Elise said quietly, though she had suspected as much for months. Almost certainly, but my testimony alone would never be sufficient to convince a territorial court, especially with Sheriff Dwyer and Judge Morrison controlling every aspect of the legal proceedings. What if we could prove that Pike's motives went far beyond simple land acquisition? Atsadi asked intently. What if we could demonstrate that Henry's death was directly connected to other serious crimes, including the systematic massacre of Apache families? Dr. Harper's eyes sharpened with interest and growing alarm. Do you possess such evidence? We have some pieces of the puzzle, but we need additional proof, and we need it quickly. Pike will not wait much longer before making his next move against us, and time is running out faster than water through a broken dam. Their urgent planning session was violently interrupted by the sound of breaking glass from somewhere in the front part of the building, followed immediately by the acrid smell of smoke and the unmistakable crackling sound of flames taking hold in dry wood. Someone had thrown a burning torch through the schoolhouse window, and the fire was spreading with alarming speed through the tinder-dry interior. My documents. Hannah cried in anguish, rushing frantically to gather the papers scattered across her table before the flames could reach them. Atsadi was already in motion, grabbing Hannah's most crucial files, while Dr. Harper helped Elise collect anything that might serve as evidence against Pike in a future legal proceeding. Smoke was filling the room with increasing density, making it difficult to see clearly and even harder to breathe normally. The back door quickly, Atsadi called out. Leading the way through the increasingly dangerous maze of the building's interior toward their only remaining avenue of escape. They burst out into the cold night air just as the sound of approaching horses reached their ears, too many horses moving with the coordinated precision of men who had planned this attack carefully and knew exactly what they intended to accomplish. The woodshed, Hannah said desperately, pointing toward a small outbuilding where she stored firewood and garden tools during the winter months. They had barely reached the minimal cover it provided when riders swept around both sides of the burning schoolhouse with military efficiency, their weapons drawn and ready for immediate action. In the wildly flickering light cast by the spreading fire, Elise could clearly make out Deadshot Murphy's horribly scarred face and the unmistakable bulk of Greasy Pete beside him. Search every inch of the area systematically. Deadshot commanded with professional authority. They cannot have gotten very far on foot, and we need to find them before they have a chance to spread any more of their poisonous lies. From their precarious hiding place, the four fugitives watched helplessly as Pike's men conducted a thorough search of every possible hiding spot in the immediate vicinity of the blazing schoolhouse. The fire was spreading rapidly now, consuming years of Hannah's painstaking research, and threatening to jump to neighboring structures if the wind shifted in the wrong direction. We have to move soon, Atsadi whispered urgently. The fire will draw more attention from town, and they will expand their search perimeter to include areas that are not currently covered. But even as he spoke, they could hear additional riders approaching from the direction of Willow Springs proper, far too many to fight effectively, and definitely too many to evade in the open ground that surrounded the schoolhouse. It was Dr. Harper who provided an unexpected solution to their seemingly impossible dilemma. My medical bag, he said quietly, pointing to the black leather satchel he had dropped during their hasty evacuation. If I go back to retrieve it, claiming that I was making an emergency house call when the fire started, they will have no reason to suspect that any of you are still in the area. That's far too dangerous, Elise protested immediately. Actually, it's considerably less dangerous than all four of us being discovered together in this hiding place. I can legitimately claim that I saw the fire from my office window and came to offer whatever assistance I could provide. Even Pike's men would not dare to interfere with a doctor responding to a community emergency. Before anyone could raise additional objections, Dr. Harper stepped boldly out of their hiding place and walked with complete confidence toward the burning building, calling out loudly to the searchers about the urgent need to organize a proper bucket brigade before the fire could spread to other structures and threatened the entire town. The diversion worked exactly as planned. Pike's men found themselves essentially forced to assist in fighting the fire or risk having the entire community learn that they had stood idly by, while buildings burned and lives were potentially endangered. In the confusion and activity that followed, Atsadi was able to lead Hannah and Elise safely away from the schoolhouse area, using the darkness and the noise of firefighting efforts to mask their careful withdrawal. They made their way through back streets and alleyways to Dr. Harper's office, a small but well-equipped building located behind his modest house that served as both medical clinic and emergency surgery. There, surrounded by the tools and instruments of healing, they took careful stock of what they had managed to salvage from the flames of Hannah's destroyed research. Not very much, I'm afraid. Hannah admitted sadly, looking at the pitifully small stack of papers they had managed to rescue. But perhaps enough to establish Pike's basic pattern of illegal land acquisition, if we can find the right people to present it to. And we still have this, Atsadi said, producing the distinctive horseshoe he had carried all the way from Owl Canyon. Physical evidence that directly links Pike to the massacre, assuming we can prove which of his horses actually wore it. That might indeed be possible. Dr. Harper said thoughtfully, when he rejoined them an hour later, his clothes smudged with soot, but his expression cautiously optimistic. I have treated various injuries and ailments affecting Pike's horses over the years, including several cases of hoof problems that required very specific types of corrective shoeing. My veterinary records should contain detailed information about which animals needed such distinctive modifications to their shoes. It was a slender thread of hope, but it represented something concrete they could work toward. More importantly, it suggested a plan of action that did not require them to remain passive, while Pike systematically eliminated every potential witness to his various crimes. Tomorrow, Elise said with quiet determination, studying the bent horseshoe in the flickering lamplight. Tomorrow we find that horse, we gather the proof we need, and we make Roland Pike answer for everything he has done to innocent people. But even as she spoke the words, Elise could not shake the growing certainty that Pike would not wait passively for them to build a case against him. The burning of the schoolhouse proved that he was prepared to escalate his campaign of intimidation and violence to whatever level might be necessary to protect his interests. The next 24 hours would likely determine whether justice would finally be served or whether Pike's reign of terror would continue unchallenged for years to come. The storm that had provided cover for their planning session also trapped them in various hiding places around Willow Springs for the better part of 2 days, during which Pike's search parties systematically combed through every canyon creek bed and abandoned building within a 20-mile radius. When the weather finally cleared enough to allow safe movement, they emerged to discover that their enemy had not been idle during the enforced delay. Dr. Harper brought the first alarming news when he managed to make contact through a carefully arranged meeting at an old line cabin several miles outside of town. Pike had somehow convinced the territorial authorities that a full-scale Apache uprising was brewing throughout the region, pointing to the kidnapping of a white woman and the murder of several upstanding citizens as clear evidence that immediate and decisive military intervention was required to prevent a general massacre of innocent settlers. 2 full companies of cavalry are en route from Fort Bayard with orders to restore order by any means necessary, Harper reported with obvious dismay. Their instructions include establishing temporary internment camps for any Apache individuals not already confined to official reservations, pending a complete investigation of recent hostilities. The implications were absolutely staggering in their scope and consequences. Pike was preparing to use the United States Army as an unwitting instrument in his personal campaign of ethnic cleansing, turning the federal government's own military forces against the very people he had been systematically murdering under the cover of manufactured tribal conflicts. "How much time do we have before the soldiers arrive?" Atsadi asked with deadly calm. "Perhaps 3 days, possibly 4, if the roads remain muddy and difficult to traverse because of the recent storms." "Then we have even less time than we originally thought." Elise said grimly. We must find a way to get our evidence to someone with sufficient authority to countermand those military orders before it's too late to prevent a catastrophe. But their limited options were becoming more constrained by the hour. The local authorities were entirely under Pike's control, and the nearest territorial officials with enough power to override military orders were hundreds of miles away in Santa Fe. Even if they could somehow reach sympathetic ears in the territorial capital, the prospect of convincing skeptical bureaucrats to halt military operations based on the testimony of a supposedly kidnapped widow and an Apache scout seemed virtually hopeless. Their desperate planning was interrupted by the unexpected arrival of Walter Briggs, who rode into their temporary camp with all the urgency of a man fleeing for his very life. His horse was lathered with sweat and exhaustion, and Briggs himself showed clear signs of having been roughly handled by unfriendly interrogators. "They know everything," he gasped as he dismounted with obvious difficulty, his face bearing fresh bruises and his clothes torn from violent handling. "Pike's men came to my ranch early this morning with questions about missing documents and secret meetings. They were not inclined to accept polite denials." "What did you tell them?" Hannah asked with growing alarm. "Nothing at first, I swear it. But then they brought my youngest son out of the house." Briggs' voice broke with shame and exhaustion as he gestured toward his horse, where a small bundle wrapped in blankets was secured behind the saddle. "They had bound and gagged little Tommy, threatened to hurt him badly if I refused to cooperate with their investigation." The bundle stirred slightly, and Elise realized with horror that it contained an actual child, Briggs' 8-year-old son, who had been used as leverage to force his father's compliance with Pike's demands. "I told them everything I knew." Briggs continued, his voice heavy with guilt and despair. "About the metal box I gave you, about your plans to gather evidence against Pike about this meeting place. I'm sorry beyond words, but I simply could not let them harm my boy." How long ago did this happen? Atsadi was already moving with swift efficiency, gathering weapons and supplies in preparation for immediate departure under hostile conditions. 2 hours, perhaps 3 at most. They told me I had until sunset to collect my family and leave the territory permanently, or they would come looking for all of us with considerably less charitable intentions. A lie designed to give them time to organize a proper ambush, Dr. Harper said bluntly. Pike cannot afford to leave witnesses alive at this point, especially witnesses who know about his deception regarding the military situation. As if summoned by his ominous words, the sound of approaching horses began to echo off the canyon walls around them. Far too many horses moving far too quickly for any legitimate or peaceful purpose. Pike had apparently decided that subtle manhunts and careful legal maneuvering were no longer adequate for dealing with the growing threat to his various enterprises. "How many do you estimate?" Elise asked, checking the loads in her shotgun with hands that remained remarkably steady, despite the desperate nature of their circumstances. "At least a dozen, possibly more," Atsadi replied, after listening carefully to the sounds of pursuit. "Too many to fight directly with any hope of success. And they know this terrain as well as we do." "Then we don't fight them on their terms," Elise said with sudden inspiration. "We go somewhere we can make our stand on equal footing, and we force them to come to us." "Where exactly do you have in mind?" "Pike's own ranch headquarters. If we can reach his main house and the documents he keeps there, we might be able to find the evidence we need while his men are out here hunting us in empty canyons." It was an audacious plan that bordered on suicidal, requiring them to travel across nearly 20 miles of open country while being actively pursued by superior numbers of well-armed enemies who knew every trail and hiding place in the region. But it also offered something their current situation completely lacked the possibility of actually obtaining the proof they desperately needed, rather than simply running until they were finally cornered and killed. The chase that followed tested every skill and resource they possessed. Pike's men pressed their pursuit with professional determination, forcing the fugitives to use every trick of concealment and misdirection they could devise to stay ahead of their relentless trackers. They abandoned their horses when the terrain became too rough for mounted travel, proceeding on foot through areas where even experienced riders would have difficulty following their trail. But Pike's men were not easily discouraged, and as the day wore on, it became increasingly clear that they were being herded toward a specific destination, rather than simply being hunted at random. Pike had anticipated their movements with disturbing accuracy, positioning his forces to drive them inexorably toward whatever trap he had prepared for their final confrontation. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, they found themselves approaching the cluster of buildings that comprised Pike's ranch headquarters, a collection of sturdy log structures dominated by a large main house that served as both residence and fortress. But instead of the working ranch they had expected to find, the compound appeared to have been converted into something resembling a military stronghold, with armed guards posted at strategic points and defensive positions that suggested Pike had been preparing for exactly this kind of assault. "It's a trap," Dr. Harper observed unnecessarily. "Of course it's a trap," Elise replied with grim determination. "But it's also our only remaining chance to find the evidence we need before those cavalry companies arrive, and Pike's final victory becomes complete and permanent." "The main house will be heavily defended," Atsadi warned. "Getting inside will require either exceptional luck or considerable sacrifice." "Then we'd better make sure we have both," Elise said, checking her weapon one final time as they prepared for what would almost certainly be their last desperate gamble for justice and survival. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson when they made their final approach to Roland Pike's stronghold. It should have been a beautiful sight, the kind of sunset that made even hardened frontier settlers pause in wonder at the natural majesty surrounding them. Instead, it felt like a funeral pyre for hopes and dreams that would likely die with them in the coming darkness. But as they moved carefully through the gathering shadows toward their final confrontation with the man who had destroyed so many innocent lives, Elise felt a strange sense of peace settling over her. Win or lose, live or die, she would finally have the chance to look Roland Pike in the eyes and make him answer for what he had done to Henry, to the Apache families at Owl Canyon, and to every other victim of his insatiable greed and twisted desire for revenge. The time for running and hiding was over. Now came the reckoning that had been building since the moment Pike's men had murdered her husband in cold blood and branded her like an animal to ensure her silence. Whatever happened in the next few hours, justice would finally have its day in the fading light of the territorial sunset. Pike's ranch compound sprawled across a natural depression between two rocky ridges, the buildings positioned to take advantage of both the available water supply and the defensive benefits of the surrounding terrain. The main house sat at the center of the complex like a spider in the middle of its web, a two-story log structure with thick walls and narrow windows that could serve as firing ports if the need arose. But it was the modifications Pike had made to his property that truly revealed the depth of his paranoia and the extent of his preparations for trouble. Gun positions had been carved into the rocky outcroppings around the compound. Guard towers offered commanding views of all approaches, and what appeared to be a small arsenal had been established in one of the outbuildings. "He's been preparing for war," Hannah whispered as they observed the layout from their concealment among a cluster of boulders. "He's been preparing for this specific moment," Atsadi corrected grimly. Pike knew that eventually someone would piece together enough of his crimes to threaten him seriously. All of this is designed to ensure that when that day came, he would be ready for it. As if to emphasize the point, armed figures began emerging from various buildings and taking positions around the compound perimeter. Pike had apparently decided that the time for subtlety and legal maneuvering was over, and he was prepared to settle accounts through direct violence, if necessary. Elise said suddenly, pointing toward a light that had just appeared in an upper window of the main house. Someone's moving around on the second floor. If Pike keeps his most important documents anywhere, it would be in his private study up there. Getting inside that house will be like walking into the mouth of hell itself, Dr. Harper observed with considerable understatement. Then we'd better make sure we accomplish something worthwhile while we're there, Elise replied with deadly determination. Atsadi studied the compound layout with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years evaluating tactical situations and developing strategies for survival against overwhelming odds. We'll need a diversion to draw their attention away from the main house. Something significant enough to make them commit most of their forces to dealing with it. What did you have in mind? Walter Briggs asked, surprising everyone by speaking up for the first time since their arrival. Fire, Atsadi said simply. The hay barn and the horse stable are both positioned downwind from the main house. If we can set them ablaze simultaneously, the smoke and confusion should provide enough cover for someone to reach Pike's study unseen. Someone meaning me, Elise said with quiet certainty. Absolutely not, Dr. Harper protested immediately. The risk is far too great, and we cannot afford to lose you when you're the only one who can testify about Pike's direct involvement in your husband's murder. And I'm the only one small enough and fast enough to get inside that house without being detected. Elise countered. Besides, this is my fight more than anyone else's. Henry died because Pike wanted our land and water rights. I'll be the one to make him pay for that crime. The argument might have continued indefinitely, but it was settled by the appearance of Roland Pike himself on the front porch of the main house. Even at a distance, his silver hair was unmistakable in the light spilling from the open doorway behind him. He stood there for several minutes, surveying his domain, with the satisfaction of a man who believed he had finally achieved complete control over his enemies and his environment. He's waiting for us, Atsadi observed. This entire setup is designed to draw us into a final confrontation on his terms and his ground. Then let's not disappoint him, Elise said, rising from their concealment with her shotgun held ready. Walter, can you and Dr. Harper create enough disturbance with those fires to keep Pike's men occupied for at least 10 minutes? We can manage that, Briggs replied with more confidence than he had shown since his arrival. But what about you? How will you get out of that house once you've found what we need? I'll improvise, Elise said with a smile that held no humor whatsoever. I've gotten quite good at that recently. The next few minutes would determine whether their desperate gamble would succeed or whether Pike's careful preparations would prove sufficient to crush their final attempt at justice. Either way, Elise knew with absolute certainty that her running and hiding were finally over. Tonight, in the flickering light of burning buildings and the deadly shadows of Pike's stronghold, the long-delayed reckoning would finally take place. And when it was over, either Roland Pike would answer for his crimes, or she would die in the attempt to make him do so. The attack began exactly as planned, with Walter Briggs and Dr. Harper approaching the hay barn from opposite directions, while Atsadi created a diversion near the main gate by taking carefully aimed shots at the guard positions. The combination of threats forced Pike's defenders to spread their attention across multiple targets, exactly as they had hoped. The fires caught and spread with terrifying speed, sending pillars of flame and smoke into the night sky that could be seen for miles in every direction. Pike's men rushed to contain the blazes, shouting orders and organizing bucket brigades in a desperate attempt to prevent the destruction of the entire compound. In the confusion, Elise made her move. She approached the main house from the blind side, using the smoke as cover and the noise of firefighting to mask any sounds she might make. A drainage gully provided concealment for most of her approach, and she was able to reach the foundation of the house without being detected by the distracted guards. The back door was locked, but the frame was old, and the wood had been weakened by years of frontier weather. A few moments of careful work with her knife allowed her to slip the latch and ease inside without alerting anyone to her presence. The interior of Pike's house was surprisingly luxurious for a frontier dwelling furnished with expensive items that must have cost more than most settlers saw in several years of hard work. But Elise had no time to appreciate the surroundings. She could hear footsteps and voices elsewhere in the house, and she knew that her window of opportunity would not remain open for very long. The stairs to the second floor creaked ominously under her weight, but the sounds of combat outside seemed to cover any noise she made. Pike's study was exactly where she had expected to find it, a large room at the front of the house with windows that commanded a view of the entire compound. And there, in the center of a massive oak desk, sat an open strongbox filled with documents that would have made any prosecutor weep with joy. Letters detailing bribes paid to territorial officials, maps showing planned attacks on Apache settlements, financial records documenting payments to hired killers, and most damning of all, a complete confession written in Pike's own hand, describing his role in Henry Hart's murder and the reasons behind it. Elise began stuffing papers into her shirt, working as quickly as possible, while straining to hear any indication that her presence had been discovered. The confession alone would be enough to hang Pike, but the other documents would implicate dozens of his associates and ensure that his entire criminal enterprise was thoroughly destroyed. She had just secured the last of the crucial papers when she heard footsteps on the stairs behind her, heavy, deliberate steps that belonged to someone who was not trying to move quietly. Pike had discovered her presence, and he was coming to deal with her personally. Mrs. Elise Hart. Pike's voice came from the doorway, cultured and calm, despite the chaos raging outside his windows. I must admit, you have proven to be considerably more resourceful than I initially gave you credit for. Elise turned slowly to face him, her hand moving instinctively toward the shotgun she carried. Pike stood in the entrance to his study with a revolver held casually, but ready, his pale blue eyes reflecting the light of the fires burning outside. "Mr. Pike," she replied with equal calm, "I've come to collect something that belongs to me." "And what might that be?" "As justice for my husband's murder. The truth about what you did to those Apache families. An end to your reign of terror in this valley." Pike's smile was cold as winter wind. "Admirable goals, but I'm afraid you won't be leaving here alive to share your discoveries with anyone else. You see, this entire evening has been carefully orchestrated to ensure that all loose ends are finally tied up permanently, including your own men out there fighting those fires. Expendable pawns, nothing more. The real prize was always getting you and your Apache friend to come here where I could deal with you properly." Pike's eyes glittered with malevolent satisfaction. "Did you really think I would leave evidence of my activities lying around where any random burglar might stumble across it?" Elise's heart sank as she realized the implications of his words. The documents, carefully prepared fakes designed to tell you exactly what you wanted to hear. The real records are safely hidden where they will never be found. Pike raised his weapon with deliberate slowness. "But I must thank you for making this so convenient. Your death here will be easily explained as the unfortunate result of your association with hostile Apache raiders." "You're forgetting something," Elise said quietly. "And what might that be? I'm not the only one who knows the truth about what you've done." Pike's confident expression flickered slightly. "Your Apache friend will not survive the night, either, I assure you. Nor will any of the others who have assisted in your foolish crusade." "What about her?" A new voice spoke from the shadows near the window. Hannah Wells, who had somehow managed to enter the house undetected, while Pike's attention was focused on Elise. The young schoolteacher held a small Derringer pistol that trembled slightly in her hands, but remained pointed steadily at Pike's back. "Drop your weapon, Mr. Pike, or I will shoot you where you stand." Pike began to turn toward this new threat, but Elise was already moving. Her shotgun came up smoothly, and for a moment, the three of them formed a deadly triangle in the flickering light of the burning compound outside. "It's over, Pike," Elise said with quiet finality. "Even if those documents are fake, we have enough real evidence to destroy you. The horseshoe from Owl Canyon, Dr. Harper's medical testimony, Walter Briggs's eyewitness account of your methods. You're finished. Pike's face twisted with rage and desperation. You have nothing. Nothing that would stand up in any court, and no court that would listen to the testimony of Indians and disgraced widows. What about a territorial marshal? The new voice belonged to Apache, who appeared in the doorway behind Pike with his rifle trained on the rancher's chest. Marshal Crawford is already en route from Santa Fe with orders to investigate reports of corruption and illegal military requisitions. He should arrive sometime tomorrow, and I suspect he will be very interested in hearing our complete story. Pike's weapon wavered as he found himself surrounded by enemies, with nowhere to run and no hope of escape. The fires outside were finally being brought under control, and the sounds of combat were dying away as his surviving men either fled or surrendered to superior numbers. You think you've won, Pike said with bitter hatred. But there are others like me, others who understand that this territory will never be truly civilized until it's cleansed of undesirable elements. My death will only make me a martyr to their cause. And your death. Elise lowered her shotgun slightly. Who said anything about killing you? You're going to live long enough to stand trial for your crimes, to face the families of everyone you've murdered, to watch your empire crumble into dust. Death would be too easy for someone like you. Pike's face went pale as he realized that his enemies intended something far worse than a quick death in combat. They meant to drag him before the courts to expose his crimes to public scrutiny, to let him live with the consequences of his actions for whatever years remained to him. In that moment of realization and despair, Roland Pike made his final fatal mistake. Instead of surrendering to capture and trial, he chose to go down fighting. His revolver swung toward Elise with desperate speed, and his finger tightened on the trigger. But he was not fast enough. 3 shots rang out simultaneously, Elise's shotgun, Hannah's derringer, and Atsadi's rifle, all speaking at the same moment. Pike was thrown backward by the multiple impacts, his own shot going wild and shattering a window as he fell. Roland Pike died as he had lived violently, surrounded by the wreckage of his own making, with the smoke of burning buildings filling his lungs and the sound of his enemies' voices ringing in his ears. But even in death, he had accomplished one final act of spite. As he fell, his blood splattered across the papers scattered on his desk, ruining several crucial documents and making others difficult to read. Even fake or not, they might have provided additional evidence of his criminal network. The immediate aftermath of Pike's death brought a strange sense of anticlimax after so many months of desperate struggle. The fires were extinguished, his surviving men were rounded up and disarmed, and the compound fell silent except for the sound of wind whistling through the broken windows of the main house. But the larger fight was far from over. There were still corrupt officials to be exposed, innocent people to be freed from Pike's various schemes, and a military expedition to be turned back before it could carry out its tragic mission against Apache families who had committed no crimes except existing in territory that Pike had wanted for himself. As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed to promise better days ahead, Elise stood among the ruins of Pike's empire and felt the first real hope she had experienced since Henry's death. The battle was won, but the war for justice and truth would continue for however long it took to make things right. And she would be there to see it through to the end, no matter what obstacles and enemies might still lie ahead. Marshal Thomas Crawford arrived in Willow Springs 3 days later, accompanied by a full company of cavalry and a team of territorial investigators with broad powers to examine every aspect of Pike's operations. Crawford was exactly the kind of lawman Atsadi had described: honest, thorough, and completely immune to the local political pressures that had allowed Pike's criminal enterprise to flourish for so long. The investigation that followed was exhaustive and methodical. Crawford's team examined every document, interviewed every witness, and traced every financial transaction they could find connected to Pike's various schemes. What they discovered exceeded even their worst expectations about the scope and depth of corruption in the territorial administration. Pike's network had indeed extended far beyond Willow Springs, reaching into multiple counties and involving dozens of officials at various levels of government. The fake Apache raids had been only one part of a much larger plan to destabilize the entire region for Pike's economic benefit, and his death had prevented what might have become a catastrophic escalation of violence between settlers and tribal communities. Dr. Harper's medical testimony proved crucial in establishing that Henry Hart and several other victims had been murdered rather than killed in legitimate confrontations. The detailed analysis of wound patterns and bullet trajectories provided scientific evidence that even the most skeptical judges could not dismiss, creating an unshakable foundation for the prosecution of Pike's surviving associates. Hannah Wells's painstakingly collected documentation of land fraud cases allowed the territorial government to begin the process of returning stolen property to its rightful owners and compensating families who had been driven from their homes by Pike's illegal tactics. The scope of restitution required would take months to complete, but at least the process could finally begin. Walter Briggs proved to be a valuable witness despite his initial reluctance to become involved. His insider knowledge of Pike's methods and his detailed testimony about the threats and intimidation used to ensure cooperation provided prosecutors with the evidence they needed to build cases against numerous secondary defendants. But it was Atsadi's physical evidence from the Owl Canyon massacre that provided the most dramatic moments in the subsequent trials. The horseshoe bearing Pike's distinctive brand, combined with testimony from Apache witnesses and the carved initials found at the raiders' campsite, created an unassailable case that Pike had indeed been responsible for the systematic murder of innocent families. The trials themselves became a sensation throughout the territory, drawing newspaper reporters and legal observers from as far away as Denver and San Francisco. The scope of Pike's criminal activities and the depth of official corruption they had revealed made for compelling reading, and the proceedings were covered in detail by papers throughout the American West. Sheriff Malcolm Dwyer was among the first to be convicted, facing charges that included accepting bribes, conspiracy to commit murder, and falsifying official documents. His testimony, obtained in exchange for a slightly reduced sentence, implicated numerous other officials and provided prosecutors with roadmaps to additional cases that might otherwise have been impossible to prove. Judge Morrison and his blacksmith brother faced similar charges, along with several other county officials whose lavish lifestyles had always seemed inconsistent with their modest salaries. The cleanup of local government would take years to complete, but at least the process of reform could begin with Pike's criminal organization finally exposed and destroyed. The Apache community received a measure of justice as well, with Wakiza and other tribal leaders invited to testify before territorial officials about their experiences and their recommendations for preventing future tragedies. While the legal system could not restore the murdered families to life, it could at least acknowledge that their deaths had been criminal acts rather than legitimate military operations. Perhaps most importantly, the cavalry expedition that had been dispatched to establish internment camps was recalled before it could reach its destination. The orders Pike had obtained through fraud and deception were canceled, and new policies were implemented to ensure that future military actions against tribal communities would require much higher levels of evidence and authorization. As autumn gave way to winter, the various legal proceedings began to reach their conclusions. Pike's surviving associates received sentences ranging from lengthy prison terms to permanent banishment from the territory, effectively dismantling the network of corruption and violence that had terrorized the region for so many months. For Elise, the end of the trials brought a mixture of profound relief and uncertain anticipation about the future. Justice had been served more completely than she had ever dared to hope, but she now faced the challenge of rebuilding her life in a community where everyone knew the intimate details of her ordeal and her struggle for vindication. The water rights to Ghost Creek had been fully restored to her control, along with substantial compensation for the property that Pike's men had destroyed during their campaign of harassment and intimidation. More importantly, she had discovered within herself reserves of courage and determination that she had never suspected existed, qualities that would serve her well in whatever challenges the future might bring. Atsadi had been offered a permanent position with the Territorial Marshal's office work that would allow him to travel throughout the region, investigating similar cases and ensuring that Pike's methods would not be replicated elsewhere by other ambitious criminals. It was dangerous work that would keep him away from Willow Springs for long periods, but it offered the satisfaction of protecting innocent people from the kind of systematic oppression they had fought so hard to overcome. "Will you be staying in Willow Springs?" he asked Elise during one of his brief visits to town before departing on his first official assignment. "For now," she replied thoughtfully. "This is my home, despite everything that has happened here. But I'm no longer the same woman who stood in that barn and watched her possessions being auctioned to pay a fraudulent debt. I've learned things about myself that I never expected to discover." "You've learned that you're stronger than you ever imagined," Atsadi observed with quiet admiration. "I've learned that I'm stronger than my enemies expected and wiser about the true price of remaining silent when confronted with evil and injustice." They were sitting on the porch of her rebuilt cabin, watching the sun set over mountains that no longer seemed threatening, but had returned to their natural role as simply beautiful features of the landscape she called home. Ghost Creek ran clear and full beside the house, its voice once again a source of comfort rather than a reminder of what she had nearly lost to her enemy's greed and hatred. "There will be other men like Pike," Atsadi said with the certainty of someone who had seen enough of human nature to understand its darker possibilities. "Other people who believe that their grief or anger or simple desire for wealth justifies terrible actions against innocent victims." "Yes," Elise agreed. "But there will also be people willing to stand against them, willing to risk everything for the sake of justice and truth. That's the lesson I'll carry with me for the rest of my life, that ordinary people, when they find the courage to act according to their principles, can accomplish extraordinary things." It was a philosophy that would sustain both of them through many future challenges and confrontations. In the years that followed, they would indeed encounter other versions of Roland Pike, men and women whose personal grievances or limitless ambitions led them to prey upon the weak and defenseless. But they would also find allies and supporters, people who understood that the price of civilization was constant vigilance against those who would exploit and corrupt it for their own purposes. The trials were over, but the larger work of building a more just and peaceful society was just beginning. And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky above Willow Springs, Elise's heart felt a deep sense of satisfaction in knowing that she had played her part in making that better world possible. The bet that had started everything Deadshot Murphy's crude attempt to destroy her reputation and drive her from her home had instead become the catalyst for exposing a criminal conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. What Pike's men had intended as her final humiliation had become the first step in their own destruction. Justice had been served, truth had triumphed over lies, and the innocent victims of Roland Pike's twisted ambitions could finally rest in peace. It was enough, more than enough, to justify all the risks and sacrifices that had been required to achieve it. And as Elise prepared to face whatever the future might bring, she did so with the absolute certainty that she would never again allow fear or intimidation to silence her voice when confronted with wrongdoing. Pike had tried to brand her as his property, to mark her as a victim who would never dare to speak against him. Instead, he had created his own most determined and effective enemy, a woman who had learned that the only way to defeat evil was to face it directly regardless of the personal cost involved. The scar on her scalp would always remain as a reminder of what she had endured and overcome. But it was no longer a mark of shame or victimization. It had become a badge of honor, proof that she had confronted the worst that cruel and powerful men could inflict upon the innocent and had emerged victorious despite seemingly impossible odds. Roland Pike was dead, his empire of corruption and violence destroyed, and his victims finally avenged. The sun would rise tomorrow over a territory that was measurably more just and peaceful than it had been the day before. And Elise Hart had played an essential role in making that transformation possible. It was a legacy that any person could be proud to claim, and a foundation upon which to build whatever new challenges and opportunities the future might provide.